So you've decided to take up fishing and you've begun to watch YouTube videos on what it takes to learn how to fish and how to become a good fisherman. Well, we're going to talk about 4 basic principles you need to know ahead of time in order to become a good fisherman and at least enjoy fishing. So let's talk about it. Be right back. Hey, thanks for sticking around. This is Gen 10-9, where we give common sense advice for everyday fishing and hunting situations for your average sportsman. And today we're talking about the 4 fundamental principles to enjoying your fishing experience. So with that in mind, let's get started. So the first important principle to learning how to fish is you've got to get your bait or your lure within close proximity of the fish. And that's kind of obvious, but the point being, it doesn't matter how good your cast is to the opposite side of the bank or how attractive your lure is if there are no fish within proximity of your lure. So this water I'm fishing in is kind of stained. It's not bad. I would say it's about 2 feet to 3 feet of clarity, which is really good. So, you know, a fish, if it's over on this side of the bank, is not going to travel the distance of the creek, the width of the creek, to get to my lure. The fish doesn't want to work that hard. So the first important principle is getting your lure within proximity of the fish. If you don't have your lure within a decent or accessible proximity to the fish, then it doesn't matter how big the fish are in your pond or in your creek. If they're not close to your lure, then you have to try to fish somewhere else. And so the most important thing to remember when you're fishing is get your bait or get your lure within close proximity of the fish. So the second most important thing you need to remember when you're learning how to fish is the principle of the appetite. So if a fish is feeding, actively feeding, and if they need to feed in preparation for a cycle of life while they're either getting ready to breed or spawn, or maybe they're getting ready to hunker down for the winter, they have to feed in preparation for that life cycle. So when you're fishing in that kind of situation, you can almost throw anything in front of a fish and they'll eat it. They just can't be choosy. They have to get ready to prepare for their next life cycle. But if the fish aren't biting, if they're not hungry, or a front has come in and put them down, or maybe it's just the middle of the day and they prefer to feed towards the evening or the morning, really it doesn't matter how good your lure looks or whether you're using live bait. The reality is they're not biting. So after a while, you just have to realize the bite's off and I just need to relax and enjoy myself while I'm fishing. For example, we've all heard stories about how the 9-year-old Boy Scout or Girl Scout was fishing with a bobber and a worm on their Zebco rod and reel and caught a 7-pound bass. Now, was their equipment, was it their equipment? Were they using superior equipment? Or was their technique better? Or were they presenting their lure in the right manner? Well, of course not. They just were fortunate enough to be fishing during a period when the fish was aggressively feeding. So, you know, the best time to fish is when the fish are aggressively feeding or actively feeding. And it's a lot of fun to fish when they're not aggressively feeding or actively feeding. I mean, which would you rather be doing? Would you rather be at work or would you rather be fishing? So the point is, the second most important principle to remember while you're learning how to fish is, are the fish aggressively eating? And if they are, you can almost throw anything at them and you're gonna catch fish and it's gonna be a lot of fun. But if you don't, you just have to remember they may not be actively feeding and I'm not in close proximity to them, so it's just tough fishing for now. So the third thing you need to remember when you're learning how to fish is the principle of presentation. And that's kind of a really important principle, and it's most important during that periods when the fish are not actively feeding, not aggressively feeding, and they're not feeding at all. You know, maybe the fish are moving into a staging area to get ready to feed, maybe close to the evening or in the morning, or maybe they're in, a feeding mode or thinking about moving into feeding mode because a front is coming through or beginning to come through and the fish feel the need to start feeding. That's when the principle of presentation is most important. When I started this video, I was fishing with a bright colored square bill, and that's because I just thought, well, we'll just see if fish are actively feeding and where they're at in this stream. And the same is true for, a pond. If I was starting to fish this pond, and the first thing I'd probably do is throw out a square bill and cover some water surface in hopes that maybe I'll get something actively feeding. But I fished with that square bill, I covered this water, and I really got no activity. So instead of fishing with moving bait near the surface or in the middle of the water column, now I'm using a jig with a crawfish on it. And in doing so, I changed my presentation of my bait for the fish, and lo and behold, here we go with the right presentation. I was fortunate enough to catch my second smallie of the season. So this is what we mean when we're talking about presentation. These fish right now apparently are not feeding on the surface or near the surface or in the middle of the water column. That's a small smallie, but fishing's better than mowing the lawn. So the fish, the presentation is different. I started with a square bill working in the middle of the water column and didn't get any activity. So I changed to a jig with a crawfish tail on it, crawfish soft bait on it, and that was the presentation that worked for that particular fish at this particular time. So that tells me right now that fishing on the top water or fishing in the middle of the water column, that's not the kind of lure to be using. The type of lure I need to be using right now with the current weather pattern and where the fish are in the middle of the day or where the fish are right now is on the bottom. So first, I need to be presenting bait on the bottom in close proximity to the fish. And then second, I need to be presenting a bait that the fish are actively feeding on. So like I said, I started with a bright colored square bill that mimicked a shad. They weren't hitting it. So I moved to a bottom lure that mimicked a crawfish. And that's what they're feeding on right now. So I moved from one presentation to a different presentation, got my lure in close proximity. The fish are actively feeding on this type of bait, so therefore you saw the result. I got a small smallie, but the reality is I'm just trying to enjoy fishing, trying to find out if the turkey are actively gobbling. I just want to be outdoors. I don't want to be inside working. I decided to take a day off and I'm enjoying fishing. Am I catching a lot of fish? No. But I'm employing the principles I'm trying to impress upon you. One, I got the lure in close proximity to the fish. Two, the fish was actively feeding. And three, my presentation was correct for the fish during this period of the day. They're feeding on the bottom. They're feeding on crawfish or worms or things floating along the bottom. They're not interested in the middle of the water column or the top of the water column or on the surface. So I need to be presenting my bait where the fish are at, and I need to present a type of lure that the fish are actively feeding. So that's the principle of presentation. And so the fourth and final principle that you need to remember is the principle of patience. Because the fact of the matter is, fish are constantly moving, whether they're in a creek or in a pond. They're moving from the deep, they're moving to the shallow. And just because you're not catching fish where you're at right now, just wait another 10 minutes and they may move or migrate into where you're fishing. And on the flip side of that, you may be used to catching a lot of fish in your favorite spot, but for whatever reason, they're not there now. Well, they've moved out of your favorite spot and they've gone to the deep or they've gone somewhere else. But just wait 10 or 15 minutes, walk away, spend some time fishing in another place for a half hour, then come back and fish it again. And that's the principle of patience, because fish are constantly on the move. It's just a matter of time. If the fish are biting or they're getting ready to bite, they're getting ready to feed, it's just a matter of time before you may connect with your fish. But if you're impatient, then it's going to be really hard for you to enjoy your fishing experience. Try to learn just how to be patient when you're fishing and be systematic in the places you're fishing. If you get no bites, you get nothing hitting your lure or your bait, then move up the stream or move to a different section of the pond, and then maybe hit your favorite spot just before you go home again. And who knows? The fish may have moved right back into the spot behind you and you just missed them. So just learn how to be patient and systematic. And there you have it. 4 basic principles to guide you to having a better fishing experience. So in the immortal words of Sean Connery, herein endeth the lesson. If you appreciated the video, then hit like and consider subscribing. Hey, thanks for watching, and God bless.